In 1969, 32 night shift workers from a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania pharmaceutical plant vanished during their regular shift. The official report blamed a chemical spill, but with no bodies ever found, their families were left with only settlement checks and a factory abandoned for decades. But 50 years later, 3 urban explorers break into the building's sealed basement, and what they find inside is something they were never, ever meant to see, uncovering the horrifying truth about what really happened. Marcus Wheeler sat at his desk in the Pittsburgh Police Department's Cold Case Division, sorting through a stack of missing person files from the 1970s when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about the urgency in the first ring made him answer. The voice on the other end was young, breathless, scared in a way that cut through Marcus's usual professional detachment. His name was Tyler Morrison, and he claimed to have found evidence of mass murder at the old Hartwell Pharmaceuticals building. Marcus had heard crank calls before, urban explorers who'd found animal bones or old mannequins and let their imaginations run wild, but Tyler's next words made his blood freeze. He said he'd found medical equipment, restraints, bolted to gurneys, and files with names and dates that matched a mass disappearance from 1969. Marcus knew about that disappearance. His grandfather, James Wheeler, had been one of the 32 workers who'd vanished that October night, leaving behind a wife and 3 children who'd never stopped wondering what really happened. Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, telling his partner he was following up on a potential lead. The drive to the abandoned factory took 40 minutes through gray October rain that turned the industrial district into a watercolor painting of rust and decay. The Hartwell building rose from the landscape like a tomb, 5 stories of broken windows and crumbling brick, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had long since ceased to be a barrier. Tyler Morrison stood by a gap in the fence, flanked by 2 friends who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Marcus showed his badge, noting how Tyler relaxed slightly at the sight of legitimate law enforcement. The kid couldn't have been more than 22, wearing the uniform of urban explorers everywhere, tactical pants, hiking boots, camera equipment strapped to his chest. Tyler led them through the fence and into the building, through a loading dock where the metal door hung askew on broken hinges. The interior was exactly what Marcus expected from 5 decades of abandonment: graffiti-covered walls, scattered debris, the persistent smell of mold and rust. But as they descended into the basement, the atmosphere changed. The graffiti disappeared, the debris thinned out, and at the end of a concrete corridor they reached a heavy steel door that had been recently forced open, the welding marks still visible where Tyler and his friends had broken through. Beyond the door was a different world entirely. The basement level had been sealed so thoroughly that time seemed to have stopped in 1969. Fluorescent lights still hung from the ceiling, their bulbs long dead, but their fixtures intact. The walls showed water damage and mold in places, but the medical equipment remained visible: 32 gurneys with leather restraints, their metal frames showing rust but still standing in neat rows. Tyler's flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating details that made Marcus's stomach turn. IV stands beside each gurney, monitoring equipment that looked advanced for 1969, and on a metal desk in the corner, stacks of folders wrapped in plastic sheeting that Tyler had already disturbed in his initial exploration. Marcus pulled on latex gloves and picked up the nearest folder, his hands trembling as he read the name on the tab: Wheeler, James. Subject 17. The file was thick with medical charts, dosage records, and observations written in clinical language that tried to mask the horror of what had been done. His grandfather hadn't died in a chemical spill. He'd been subjected to systematic experimentation with compounds Marcus didn't recognize, drugs with code names like MK Delta and Pandora 7. Marcus forced himself to read through his grandfather's file, each page revealing another layer of the nightmare. The initial intake form, dated October 14, 1969, described James Wheeler as a healthy 34-year-old male with no significant medical history. By October 20th, the notes described severe psychological breaks, hallucinations, and violent episodes that required increased restraints. By November, the handwriting had changed, become more excited, noting that Subject 17 was showing remarkable resistance to the standard protocols and might be suitable for Phase 3 trials. The final entry was dated December 3, 1969. Subject 17 expired during enhanced interrogation resistance testing. Body transferred to Site B for disposal. Recommend cellular analysis for immunity factors. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, hot and sharp like broken glass. His grandfather hadn't just been murdered, he'd been tortured, experimented on, reduced to a number in someone's research project. Tyler stood nearby, watching nervously as Marcus went through more files. Each one told the same story. Healthy workers subjected to increasingly extreme experiments, deaths clinically documented, bodies disposed of like medical waste. The sound of footsteps above them made everyone freeze. Marcus drew his service weapon, motioning for Tyler and his friends to stay behind him. The footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Marcus called out, identifying himself as Pittsburgh police, but the footsteps continued their steady approach to the basement stairs. A man appeared in the doorway, elderly but moving with careful precision. He wore a maintenance worker's uniform with a name tag that read, Carl. His face was weathered, marked by decades of hard living, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Carl looked at the open door, at the disturbed files, at Marcus's drawn weapon, and sighed like someone who'd been expecting this day for 50 years. He told Marcus to put the gun away, that he wasn't there to hurt anyone. He was there to finally tell the truth about what happened to the night shift workers in 1969. Carl Peterson had been a security guard at Hartwell, working the day shift, but he'd been called in that night for emergency duty. What he'd witnessed had haunted him ever since. Carl's story came out in fragments like pieces of a puzzle he'd been carrying too long. Hartwell Pharmaceuticals hadn't just been making commercial drugs. They'd had a classified contract with the Department of Defense, developing chemical compounds for interrogation and behavior modification. The night shift had been chosen because they were isolated, expendable, men whose disappearance could be easily explained. The workers had been told there was a contamination event in the research wing that they needed to report to the basement for emergency decontamination. They'd walked right into the trap, trusting their employers, believing they were being protected. Instead, they'd been sedated, strapped to gurneys, and turned into test subjects for drugs designed to break down human resistance. Carl had watched from the security office as men in military uniforms supervised the operation, taking notes while the workers screamed. He'd been told that anyone who talked would end up on those gurneys himself. But Carl had done more than stay silent. He'd used his security access to make copies of key documents before they were destroyed, photographing files with an old camera during his shifts over the following weeks before the building was abandoned. The copies weren't perfect. Some were blurry, incomplete, but he'd hidden them away, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Marcus felt his phone vibrating and saw multiple missed calls from the station. When he called back, his captain's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Federal agents had shown up at the precinct asking about Marcus's whereabouts, claiming he was interfering with a classified investigation. They wanted him to cease all activities at the Hartwell site immediately. Marcus looked around the basement at the evidence of his grandfather's murder, at Tyler's young face pale with fear, at Carl's resigned expression. He told his captain he was investigating a potential crime scene and would need backup to properly secure it. The captain agreed to send units quietly, understanding that something significant had been discovered. Carl confirmed Marcus's suspicion about surveillance, explaining that the building had motion sensors installed by the company that still owned it through shell corporations. They'd been triggered when Tyler broke in, but the response was delayed because the monitoring was outsourced to a security company that only checked alerts periodically. They had maybe an hour before someone with real authority arrived to stop them. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and started recording video, documenting the basement laboratory, the gurneys, the files. He had Tyler do the same, creating multiple records that could be shared, uploaded, broadcast if necessary. Carl led them to a maintenance closet where he'd hidden a duffel bag years ago. Inside were his photographed documents, poor quality but still readable, showing transport logs, correspondence, and most importantly, a partial list of where some bodies had been taken, but their documentation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. Through the broken windows, they could see black SUVs surrounding the building, men in tactical gear taking positions at every entrance. A voice came through a bullhorn, identifying themselves as federal agents and demanding that everyone exit the building immediately. Marcus knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the agents stormed in. He grabbed as many files as he could carry, focusing on the ones with his grandfather's name, stuffing them inside his jacket. Tyler was doing the same, shoving folders into his backpack, while his friend stood frozen with fear. Carl moved with surprising speed for his age, leading them to a section of wall that looked solid but swung inward when he pressed a hidden catch. Behind it was a narrow maintenance tunnel that he explained connected to the storm drain system. It was how maintenance workers used to move between buildings without going outside, and he'd kept the passage clear over the years. They crawled through the tunnel in darkness, their phones providing the only light, listening to the sound of boots thundering through the building above them. The tunnel seemed endless, a concrete artery that smelled of rust and stagnant water. Marcus could hear Tyler breathing hard behind him, could feel the weight of the stolen files against his chest. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they emerged through a drainage grate 3 blocks from the Hartwell building. Carl had a van parked nearby, an old vehicle that wouldn't draw attention. They piled in and drove away as sirens filled the air behind them. Marcus directed Carl to drive to a storage unit he rented across town, a place he'd never mentioned to anyone at work. Once inside, with the metal door rolled down and locked, they spread the rescued files across the concrete floor and began to piece together the full scope of what had happened. The experiment hadn't been limited to the 32 night shift workers. The files referenced other sites, other groups of test subjects, a nationwide program that had used American citizens as unwitting guinea pigs for chemical weapons research. The drugs they'd developed had names that would later become infamous: variations of LSD, primitive versions of what would become truth serums, compounds designed to induce paralysis while keeping the subject conscious and aware. Page after page documented suffering with clinical detachment, treating human agony as data points in research that had been deemed vital to national security. Tyler found a file that made them all stop reading. It was a termination order dated December 15, 1969, signed by someone identified only as Director Blackwood. All test subjects were to be eliminated, their bodies destroyed, the facilities sanitized. The program was being shut down not because of conscience, but because of congressional investigations into other CIA programs that were getting too close to discovering this one. Marcus's phone rang, displaying his captain's number. When he answered, the captain's voice was different, formal, like someone was standing next to him. He told Marcus that federal agents had secured the Hartwell building and found no evidence of any crime, historical or otherwise. He suggested that Marcus come to the station to discuss what he might have misunderstood at the scene. The threat was clear even through the carefully chosen words. Marcus said he understood and hung up. He looked at Carl and Tyler, both watching him with expressions that mixed fear and determination. They all knew what would happen if Marcus turned over the files. The evidence would disappear, the truth would be buried again, and the 32 workers would remain statistics in a chemical spill that never happened. Marcus made the second crucial decision of the day. He called a reporter he knew at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, someone who'd covered police corruption and wasn't afraid of federal pressure. While they waited for her to arrive, they photographed every page, every document, uploading them to multiple cloud servers, creating a digital record that couldn't be easily destroyed. The reporter, Janet Chen, arrived within an hour, bringing a photographer and a video journalist with her. She listened to Carl's testimony, examined the files, and immediately recognized the story's magnitude. This wasn't just about 32 workers killed in 1969. This was about a pattern of human experimentation that violated every principle of medical ethics and constitutional law. As she prepared to break the story, Marcus's phone rang again. This time the number was blocked, but the voice was clear, professional, and utterly cold. The man identified himself as Director Harrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency. He explained that Marcus had stumbled onto a classified program that, while regrettable by modern standards, had been legal under the national security provisions of its time. Any attempt to publicize these materials would be considered a violation of the Espionage Act. Marcus was looking at federal prison, the loss of his pension, the destruction of his career, all for something that happened before he was born, to people who were already dead, for reasons that had made sense to people trying to win the Cold War. Marcus thought about his grandfather, about the file that described his final days in clinical terms that couldn't hide the horror. He thought about 32 families who'd been lied to for 50 years, who'd buried empty coffins and never known the truth. He told Director Harrison that the press already had the story, that copies of the documents were already beyond federal reach. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long, Marcus wondered if Harrison had hung up. Then, quietly, Harrison said that Marcus was making a mistake that would have consequences he couldn't imagine. The line went dead. Within hours, the story exploded across the internet. Janet's article, backed by the photographed documents and Carl's video testimony, spread faster than any attempt to suppress it. The headline was stark: 32 workers murdered in secret government experiment, evidence hidden for 50 years. The documents Marcus had saved proved everything. The workers had been deliberately exposed to experimental drugs, monitored as they died, their bodies disposed of in what the files called thermal reduction procedures. The federal response was swift but clumsy. Agents showed up at Marcus's apartment with a warrant, but he wasn't there. He'd anticipated this and had moved to a hotel under a false name, continuing to work with Janet to release more information. The agents found his apartment stripped of anything useful, his computer wiped, his files gone. They'd prepared for a raid but found only empty rooms and a note that said, "The truth is already out." Meanwhile, Carl had vanished entirely, his apartment empty, his van abandoned. He'd left a video testimony with Janet, explaining everything he'd witnessed, then disappeared into whatever network helps people escape federal attention. Tyler and his friends were detained and questioned for 12 hours before their lawyers got them released. The agents had tried to charge them with breaking and entering, but the building's ownership was so tangled in shell companies that no one could prove who had the authority to press charges. The story was spreading too fast, generating too much public outrage for the usual containment procedures to work. Families of the missing workers started coming forward, sharing their own stories of suspicious visits from government agents, of emergency payments that came with strict non-disclosure agreements, of threats both subtle and explicit to never ask questions about what had really happened. Martha Wheeler, Marcus's grandmother, had died believing her husband had abandoned them, never knowing he'd been murdered just miles from their home. Other families had similar stories of decades spent wondering, of children growing up without fathers, of lives destroyed by lies disguised as national security. The pressure for accountability grew with each revelation, each family's testimony adding weight to demands for a full investigation. Congress members started calling for hearings. The Department of Justice announced it would review the case for potential prosecution, though the statute of limitations had long expired for everyone except conspiracy and murder charges. The Defense Department maintained its position that any activities at Hartwell had been legal under the authority granted by executive orders that were themselves still classified. Marcus returned to work after a week, walking into a precinct where half his colleagues treated him like a hero and the other half avoided him like he had a contagious disease. His captain called him into his office and closed the door. He told Marcus that he'd done the right thing, but that federal pressure was making things difficult for the department. Marcus would be transferred to a different division, still employed, but moved away from sensitive cases until things cooled down. Marcus accepted this, knowing he'd gotten off easier than he might have. The captain asked him what he planned to do, and Marcus said he was going to keep investigating, not just Hartwell, but the entire network of facilities mentioned in the documents. The captain nodded, adding quietly that some fights were worth having, even if they came with costs. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the story broke, Marcus received a package with no return address. Inside was a single key and a note with an address for a storage facility in Ohio. The note read, "From someone who knew Carl. He wanted you to have this if something happened to him." Marcus drove 5 hours to find a storage unit filled with boxes of documents Carl had been collecting for decades. Not classified files he'd stolen, but public records he'd painstakingly assembled. Newspaper clippings about mysterious disappearances, obituaries that didn't add up, property records showing shell company purchases near the times of incidents. Carl had been building a map of the conspiracy using only publicly available information, creating a pattern that pointed to 5 other locations where similar experiments had taken place. Workers at a chemical plant in Texas, prisoners in Alabama, mental patients in Oregon. The network was vast, interconnected, and had operated with complete immunity for years before being hastily shut down when congressional oversight got too close. The documents also revealed who Director Blackwood really was. Dr. Elias Blackwood, who'd gone on to become Deputy Director of the CIA before retiring with full honors in 1985. He'd died peacefully in 2001, his obituary describing him as a patriot who'd served his country with distinction. The other names in the files told similar stories. Men who'd authorized murder and torture had gone on to successful careers, comfortable retirements, deaths surrounded by family who never knew what they'd done. The architects of the program had escaped justice completely, leaving only their victims and a paper trail that had taken 50 years to surface. Marcus spent weeks going through Carl's archive, building a comprehensive picture of the program. He found transportation records from public freight companies showing unusual shipments to Nevada facilities. He found environmental impact reports mentioning unexplained chemical residues near disposal sites. Everything pointed to a massive operation that had been hidden in plain sight. One file stopped him cold. It was a medical journal article from 1970, authored by Dr. Patricia Vaughn, titled Ethical Considerations in Human Subject Research. It was carefully written, never mentioning Hartwell directly, but describing hypothetical scenarios that matched exactly what had happened there. Marcus tracked down Dr. Vaughn, now 76 and living in a retirement community in Maryland. She'd been fresh out of her residency in 1969, only 29 years old when assigned to Hartwell as a junior physician. When Marcus showed her his badge and asked about the experiments, she started crying. She'd been waiting 50 years for someone to ask, carrying the guilt like a stone in her chest. She told him she'd tried to object, tried to report what was happening, but had been threatened with prosecution under the Espionage Act, told that her medical license would be revoked, that she'd never work again. So she'd stayed silent, left Hartwell after 3 months, and spent the rest of her career trying to atone by working in free clinics and refugee camps. Dr. Vaughn gave Marcus names he hadn't found in any documents. She remembered 2 other junior researchers who'd been troubled by what they were seeing. One had died in a car accident shortly after leaving Hartwell. The other had disappeared completely. His family told he'd taken a job overseas. She remembered a military liaison, Colonel Harrison, who'd overseen the project with cold efficiency. The name made Marcus pause. Director Harrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the man who'd threatened him on the phone. She confirmed it was likely his son, as the colonel would be in his 90s if still alive. The Harrison family had been involved in intelligence work for generations. Dr. Vaughn also revealed something that hadn't been in any of the documents. Not all the test subjects had died. 3 men had shown unusual resistance to the drugs, had been transferred to a different facility for long-term study. She didn't know where they'd been taken or what had happened to them, but she remembered overhearing discussion about keeping them for further research. This revelation sent Marcus back to Carl's public records with new purpose. He found death certificates filed in 3 different states in early 1970 for men with the same names as Hartwell workers, but the death certificates had irregularities. All 3 listed the same cause of death despite dying in different locations. All 3 were signed by doctors who didn't appear in any medical directories. All 3 bodies were cremated immediately with no autopsy. Marcus cross-referenced property records and found that all 3 locations had been owned by the same shell company that had connections to Hartwell. He tracked the shell company through corporate filings and found it had maintained a property in Virginia until 1988, a medical facility listed as a private research clinic. He drove there on a cold November morning, exactly 50 years and 1 month after his grandfather's murder. The facility was abandoned but not demolished, its building standing behind rusted fence topped with old razor wire. The main hospital building was a monument to institutional architecture, all straight lines and narrow windows. Marcus cut through the fence and entered through a loading dock door that had been pried open by previous trespassers. Inside, nature had begun reclaiming the structure. Vines grew through broken windows, birds nested in the ceiling, and moss covered the walls. But in the basement, Marcus found what he was looking for: 3 rooms, each with reinforced doors and small windows. Inside each room were the remnants of long-term medical equipment, hospital beds, monitoring devices, feeding tubes. On the wall of one room, someone had scratched "David Thompson, Hartwell, 1969, remember us." Marcus photographed everything, his hands shaking, as he realized these 3 men had been kept here for potentially 20 years, studied like laboratory animals, their existence hidden from the world. He found medical charts in a rusted filing cabinet, documenting years of tests, procedures, and observations. The 3 men were referred to only by numbers, but marginal notes revealed their names: David Thompson, Michael Kowalski, and Robert Chen. All 3 had been night shift workers at Hartwell. All 3 had families who'd been told they were dead. The final entries were from February 1988, stating that the subjects were being transferred to a continuing care facility as the site was being decommissioned. Marcus knew he was getting close to something. These 3 men might still be alive, hidden away in some classified medical facility, living proof of what had been done. He started searching public records for any facility that had received patient transfers from Virginia in 1988, focusing on long-term care institutions with government contracts. Then, 2 days before Thanksgiving, he received another unmarked package. Inside was a business card for Mountain View Care Center in West Virginia with a handwritten note. Ask about the special ward patients. A friend of Carl's. Marcus researched Mountain View and found it was a legitimate nursing facility that had a contract with the Veterans Administration for specialized care. He arrived claiming to be investigating a benefits fraud case involving a veteran who might be a patient there. The administrator was cooperative, eager to demonstrate the facility's compliance with regulations. When Marcus asked about long-term patients who'd been there since the 1980s, she mentioned they had a secured ward for patients with special medical needs, mostly veterans with classified service histories who required ongoing care. Marcus asked to verify if any of his subjects were in that ward. The administrator checked her computer and confirmed they had 3 patients who'd been transferred from a Virginia facility in 1988, though their files were restricted. She could confirm they were alive but couldn't provide access without federal authorization. Marcus knew he couldn't get official access, but he'd confirmed the 3 men were alive. He left Mountain View and called Janet Chen, telling her what he'd discovered. She arrived the next day with a camera crew and a lawyer, demanding access to the 3 men under Freedom of Information provisions. The facility administrators panicked, making phone calls to federal contacts, uncertain how to handle media attention on patients they'd been told to keep isolated. In the confusion, a sympathetic nurse who'd cared for the 3 men for years quietly led Marcus and Janet to the secured ward. In a common room, 3 elderly men sat watching television. They looked up as Marcus entered, their eyes holding a wariness that spoke of decades of disappointment. Marcus approached slowly, his heart pounding as he asked if any of them remembered working at Hartwell Pharmaceuticals. The silence stretched for so long he thought they wouldn't answer. Then one of them, a thin man with white hair and trembling hands, whispered, "You're the first person to ask about Hartwell in 30 years. David Thompson, Michael Kowalski, and Robert Chen had survived 5 decades of captivity, first as test subjects, then as prisoners, finally as forgotten men in a system that had no category for what they were. They'd been told their families were dead, that the world had forgotten them, that they were lucky to be alive at all. They'd been moved from facility to facility as programs were shut down and restarted, always kept isolated, always watched, never free. They remembered the basement at Hartwell, remembered the experiments, remembered watching other men die while they somehow survived. They remembered years at the Virginia facility being subjected to endless tests, their unusual resistance to the original drugs making them valuable subjects for other research. They remembered being told they were serving their country, that their sacrifice was meaningful, even as they begged to go home. Marcus recorded everything on his phone, their testimony, a devastating indictment of 50 years of imprisonment and abuse. David Thompson wept as he talked about his children, who'd been told he was dead, who'd grown up without him. Michael Kowalski showed Marcus scars from procedures he'd endured, marks on his body. That told a story of medical torture disguised as research. Robert Chen had kept a journal hidden in his mattress, documenting everything he could remember, names and dates and places that corroborated every document Marcus had found. They asked Marcus if their families were still alive, if anyone remembered them. Marcus had already researched this, preparing for this moment. David Thompson's wife had died in 1998, but his children were still living, had families of their own. Michael Kowalski's sister was still alive at 87, living in the same house where she'd grieved for him for 50 years. Robert Chen's daughter had become a doctor, driven by the mystery of her father's death to understand medicine. Marcus promised to reunite them with their families, to get them out of Mountain View, to finally tell their story to the world. But he knew federal agents were probably already mobilizing to prevent exactly that. He called his captain requesting official protection for 3 material witnesses in a murder investigation. The captain understood and dispatched units immediately. He called the FBI field office, specifically agents he knew weren't connected to the original cover-up, reporting the illegal detention of 3 American citizens. He called every media contact he had, ensuring that too many people knew about the 3 men for them to simply disappear again. The response was swift but chaotic. Federal agents arrived claiming jurisdiction, but local police were already there. FBI agents from the field office arrived demanding access to what they called kidnapping victims. Media crews surrounded the building, broadcasting live. In the chaos, Marcus made sure the 3 men were taken into protective custody by the local FBI, not the federal agents connected to the cover-up. The reunions with their families happened at the FBI field office, under protection and with media present. David Thompson met children who only knew him from a single photograph, grandchildren who'd never known he existed. Michael Kowalski's sister held him while they both cried, 50 years of grief and joy colliding in a single moment. Robert Chen's daughter, the doctor who'd spent her career wondering what had really killed her father, finally got to ask him directly. The answers broke her heart and filled it simultaneously. The government's response was predictable and insufficient. A formal apology for regrettable actions taken during the Cold War. A compensation package for survivors and families that couldn't begin to address 50 years of loss. A promise to declassify more documents, though anything truly damaging remained hidden behind walls of redaction and claims of ongoing security concerns. Director Harrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency was quietly reassigned, his connection to the cover-up never officially acknowledged. The facilities where experiments had taken place were designated for demolition. Hartwell Pharmaceuticals. Abandoned building was eventually torn down, but not before families of the victims held a memorial service in the parking lot, unable to access the sealed basement where their loved ones had died. Marcus stood with them, holding a photo of his grandfather, finally able to mourn properly after 50 years of lies. The investigation had changed his career but hadn't destroyed it. His captain had protected him from the worst federal retaliation, and his transfer to the Cold Case Division had actually given him more freedom to investigate historical injustices. 6 months after the Hartwell story broke, Marcus received one final package. Inside was a letter with no signature, but in handwriting he recognized as similar to Carl's earlier notes. The writer said Carl had passed away peacefully in Canada, finally free of the burden he'd carried for 50 years. He thanked Marcus for finishing what Carl had been too afraid to complete himself. He asked Marcus to remember not just the victims, but the survivors, the ones who'd carried the secret, who'd fought in small ways to preserve evidence and testimony. Marcus kept the letter, adding it to his growing archive of documents about Hartwell and its aftermath. The story wasn't over. There were still classified files that might never be released, still questions that might never be answered. But 32 men who'd died in a basement laboratory were no longer statistics in a chemical spill that never happened. David Thompson, Michael Kowalski, and Robert Chen spent their remaining years surrounded by the families they'd been denied for 5 decades. They testified before Congress, wrote books about their experiences, and became living reminders of what happens when security becomes more important than humanity. David died in 2021, holding his daughter's hand, finally at peace. Michael lived until 2023, his mind sharp until the end, his testimony helping to expose 3 other sites where similar experiments had taken place. Robert Chen survived until 2024, long enough to see a memorial erected at the site where Hartwell once stood, bearing the names of all 32 victims and the words, "They deserved the truth." Marcus Wheeler attended all 3 funerals, carrying the weight of their stories, knowing he'd been chosen by circumstance and conscience to expose one of America's darkest secrets. The conspiracy that had operated for decades was broken, its survivors free, its victims remembered. And somewhere in whatever afterlife might exist, Marcus hoped his grandfather knew that his grandson had finished the work, had brought light to the darkness, had ensured that 32 workers who'd vanished on an October night in 1969 would never be forgotten again.